Verdun was an old fortress town in northwest France, on the River Meuse, where it was crossed by a road to Paris. A symbol of national pride due to its role in the Franco-Prussian Wars and its importance as far back as the early Middle Ages, it would again earn a grimmer place in history as the venue for the most awful battle of World War I, becoming one of the most blood-soaked patches of ground in human history. In the early hours of February the 21st, over 1,200 Germans laid down the heaviest bombardment yet seen in history, lasting over 9 hours and firing nearly 2 million shells into the air. As the guns fell silent, the troops advanced south on both sides of the Meuse, which bisected the battlefield roughly north to south. The two most tactically important forts on the right bank were Forts Douaumont and Fort Vaux, but the former was disastrously lost to the Germans with barely a shot on February the 25th after a mix-up with French soldiers left one of the gates unguarded. The French flooded the area around the fort with troops, delaying the Germans long enough to set up formidable artillery around the appropriately named Dead Man's Hill on the left bank of the Meuse, which pounded the Germans every time that they tried to advance. General Pétain, an exponent of the defensive warfare measures, was put in charge of the defense of Verdun. The Germans decided that they needed to take out the French artillery on Dead Man's Hill, but this in turn was covered by gun emplacements on Hill 304. On May the 3rd, the German attack on Hill 304 began with 500 guns aiming at a field just roughly about a mile north of the emplacements. A French soldier described the horror of being under a bombardment as, "It is as if you were tied to a pole and threatened by a man with a hammer. The first hammer is swung backward in order to hit hard, but when it is swung forward it only misses your skull by an inch, splintering into the pole. In the end, you just surrender." As the war carried on, German and French forces exchanged pointless and ultimately costly attacks and counterattacks over the Fort of Vaux. It eventually fell to the Germans after a French sally to attack Fort Douaumont was repulsed with the loss of most of the French soldiers, leaving Fort Vaux undefended. The Germans moved in, and the French lost yet more men trying to retake it. In June, a chemical attack on the village of Fleury involved the first use of phosgene gas, with 110,000 poison gas shells fired by 230 guns. In the end, the attack failed anyway. In July, the Battle of Somme had diverted German resources, but French offensives continued, with equally little result. By mid-July, more than 23 million fragmentation, poison gas, and high explosive shells had been fired. Between August and September, the battle degenerated into an exhausting quagmire, with ill-defined front lines fought over a landscape of colossal shell holes. The testimony of a captain in the French army captures the horror of combat. "I have returned from the most horrible and terrible ordeal I have ever witnessed. 4 days and 4 nights, 96 hours, the last 2 days in the ice-cold mud kept under relentless fire, without any protection whatsoever except from the narrow trench, which of course seemed to be too wide. I arrived with 175 men and I returned with only 34, of whom several have turned half insane." Many of the troops suffered from dysentery, often because faulty supply lines meant that they had to eat emergency rations of salted meats, which in turn made them crazed with thirst. An eyewitness described how one soldier was going so insane with thirst that he drank from a pond covered with a greenish layer near Dead Man's Hill, with a corpse still floating in it. The sole road into Verdun, along which traveled reinforcements and supplies, came to be known as the Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way. It had to be continuously rebuilt to repair shell damage, yet nonetheless carried, during the course of the battle, 6,000 vehicles, 25,000 tons of supplies, and 90,000 soldiers. It was said that approximately 66% of the French army had passed along this road during the siege. Blocked latrines and the stench of decomposing corpses combined to create a horrendous and indelible stench that haunted men of both sides. One soldier described how you could never get rid of the horrible stench. If we were on leave and we were having a drink somewhere, it would only last a few minutes before the people at the table beside us would stand up and leave. It was impossible to endure the horrible stench of Verdun. By October of 1916, a French offensive successfully retook Fort Douaumont, but German machine gunners at Vaux had continuously repelled successive waves of attackers. The German command decided to abandon it anyway, pulling out and blowing it up. Further horrifically costly assaults behind rolling artillery barrages drove the Germans away from Verdun itself, and in many accounts, December 19th, 1916 is recorded to be the end of the Battle of Verdun. In reality, however, fresh and equally intense fighting broke out again in the autumn of 1917, when the commander of Moss Group West, General von Francois, convinced the German High Command to allocate his troops for yet another assault around Dead Man's Hill. An account by Lieutenant General August Fortmüller encapsulates the pyrrhic nature of the advances on the Verdun front. With 15 French officers and 853 men, along with such material, was captured. The cost had been heavy, though. The Germans had lost 18 officers and 1,150 men. When the attacks abated, the new German commander-in-chief Ludendorff wrote, "I was happy that the fighting there had come to an end, but I was not content that I had allowed the attacks. As before on the Eastern Front, I had an aversion to victories with such a disproportionately high cost in blood." In August of 1917, the French prepared a final assault to restore the fronts to their pre-February 1916 positions. With aerial spotters marking the positions of German reserves, French artillery had launched a bombardment that lasted for 3 weeks. French forces made slow but steady progress against ferocious German resistance, culminating in a final attack on November the 25th. French casualties are estimated to be around 390,000, dead, missing, or wounded, while the Germans had lost 142,000 dead and missing, with 187,000 wounded. These figures still exclude the continued fighting in 1917, so the real cost may have been higher still. In the end, at least 130,000 corpses were left unidentifiable, and many more were never recovered. The Battle of Verdun, according to some sources, had cost more dead per square foot than any other battlefield in recorded history.